All right, welcome back to part two of this lecture on the concept of design. And so when we last left off, I wanted you to look at these two paintings and think about them in terms of how they reflect the way each era thought about composition, right, or design, right? How the very modernist bias involved in the decision making of the Mondrian, right? Its overall emphasis towards thinking of clear contrasts, making distinctions, clarity, right, as a value. How it's very grid organized. There is some grid work, some thought about grid definitely in the Velasquez, but that's much more just the nature of the space, really. But that the overall eye movement, right, in the Velasquez is much more about flow, much more about these really kind of elaborate different kinds of hierarchies, right, of like moments where the information is extremely specific, and lots of really tiny, small, distinct marks, right? Whereas this type of hierarchy is much more straightforward, upfront, more maybe more scientific. So each painting is a reflection of how that period thought about composition and creating an image, and how each thought about design, and just the difference between the words composition and design. So we're going to take a little bit of a side step here to talk about an important part of this early 20th century moment, right? Because part of what was going on was, like, let's go back for a second. Modernist design is scientific, right? And part of that was because it was not only happening, all this design thinking was not only happening in art schools by artists and art historians, it was also happening by groups of people who were psychologists, perceptual psychologists, and they were starting to come up with, and this actually started even before the 20th century in the 1870s, 1880s. There was a group of German psychologists called the Gestalt School, and they started to be really interested in the way we perceive things. The word Gestalt in German basically means as a whole, and it was this idea of that the way we see things are often like we see things, we take them in as a whole, or more often it's the illusion that we take them in as a whole, even though we're not actually taking them in as a whole. But we'll move on from that. It gets complicated. This here is a particular kind of illusion, one of the ones that the Gestalt school discovered, right? And if you look at it, there's this sense that these gray lines bend and twist, that they're not all in the same angle, they're not all horizontal, and that they kind of curve a little bit in different directions. But they are, in fact, all perfectly straight, perfectly horizontal. Here's another kind of simple illusion, right? So this is a classic example of what Gestalt meant by seeing things as a whole. We see the cube here, even though the cube does not exist. What they're pointing out is that seeing is primarily done by our brain, right? Our mind fills in the gaps and creates the illusion that we see everything as a whole, right? Creates the illusion in this case that we're seeing a cube, even though no cube exists. It's not there. All we're seeing are circles and then little Y shapes kind of crisscrossing through the circles, but because they all line up perfectly, what we see is a cube. Here are some other types of examples, and the main point I want to make about this is that perceptual psychologists were really starting to realize that how we see things is very much based on what our brain is doing, and that this could be studied and even to a certain degree quantized. So this illusion is very similar to the first illusion that I showed you. This one really relates to that issue. Remember earlier I said that perception, one of the two fundamental rules is between kind of sympathetic association, right, versus the rule of contrast, of relative contrast. And so here, this horizontal line is the same length there and there. And why this one feels so much shorter, that's an interesting thought. So here's one where it's very definitely part of that rule of relative contrast, right? We see the red circle as larger here because it's surrounded by these much smaller white forms. And here, the exact same size red circle, but it looks smaller because it's surrounded by these larger spheres. Whereas this is much more just playing with things that tell us about illusion of space, right? So that width right there is the same as that width. So, hold on a second, let's go back. So the main point I want to make about this issue of perceptual psychology is that this was very influential on these early 20th century thinkers. They realized, wow, there's a lot to actually study about how art works, and that they could maybe get to a better understanding than just simply by following, the tradition of how painters have always painted. That said, many times they figured out that what they were discovering were things that Velázquez and Rubens already knew. It just took them a lot of study to realize that the evidence they saw in the paintings was evidence that those artists really did get it. I mean, like a good example would be like the understanding of reflective color and ambient color that you see demonstrated in a Rubens. That Rubens didn't know exactly why he saw what he saw, and why he needed to paint it the way he needed to paint it. He didn't have, he didn't understand light as being both a particle and a wave. But with our 20th century understanding, we could see that some of the artists of the Baroque definitely understood these things very well. So here, I want you to think about, we're getting back to this issue of design, and I want you to think about, remember at the beginning of the lecture I said that this lecture is both about two things. One, that design is very much real, and two, that design is how we think it. Design is based on convention, based on the decisions that we as a culture make about how we think about design. And so I want you to look at, these are like the art elements and the design principles, right? Each one is a list of 7. But like the design principles, it doesn't have to be a list of 7. If you look this up in different textbooks, if you look it up on the internet, you can find lists of 7 or lists of 9 or a list of 12, and you can find all of these or lists of 7 that have some of these, but not all, some of others. But this is the main ones, and definitely the art elements are pretty close to being universally accepted as these are the art elements. But then if you compare these lists to also this list of other design concepts, or this list of possible art elements that most people don't think of as an art element, you'll see that we covered a lot of this stuff as well in the class. That my goal in this class was not to describe design as being a system that we know absolutely to be true in every aspect. Instead, design is something that happens that we are figuring out all the time. And oftentimes the best rule is the rule of tends, right? When you describe something in design, you say, this tends to happen when I tend to do this, right? If you make a shape larger, it tends to have more visual weight, it tends to also draw more attention, have more emphasis, but not always. So anyway, so I want you just kind of like to look at this grouping. For the rest of the lecture, we're going to be talking about some of the ones on this design principle list that we didn't really cover most of class, right? Up to this point, that's my next 1 minute warning. Up to this point in this class, we covered a lot about hierarchy and emphasis. We covered a lot about balance. We covered a little bit about proportion, but we're going to talk about unity and variety a little bit more, rhythm and movement a little bit more, and economy a little bit more, as well as cover some of these others along the way. All right, I'll meet you in part 3.